consultations with clients and the public in general. So we'll begin, ladies first, with Betsy Barnum.
Thank you. Well, I have a background in journalism as well as teaching writing on the college level, so those things both factor into how I approach this issue. So usually fact-checking, as I understand it, involves making sure statements or claims or of fact in an article, essay, or book are accurate and verifiable. As editors, most of us have somewhat specialized or at least preferred subject areas that we work in, so we have a little bit of expertise in those already. So it's easier maybe to tell about something that's true and isn't true in those areas that we have familiarity with. We need research skills and, of course, a good dose of common sense. And with the internet, it's quick and easy to look things up, but you also know that the internet is not ultimately reliable. You still have to be careful. When it comes to news, there are some guidelines from factcheck.org, which you may be familiar with, and they usually will publish after a presidential speech an analysis of the fact-checking of what was said. They have some guidelines for spotting fake news that you probably have seen on social media. Things like looking at who's behind the site. If there's no names listed in the About section, that's a red flag. Or checking to see that the headline is actually not either exaggerated or completely unrelated to the actual information. And of course, checking the sources that are cited in the article itself. Those are just some of the things. So my specialty is academic editing, which has its own set of issues when it comes to fact-checking. Since much of the work that I edit is done by people who know their subject area far better than I ever could, and it varies across the board, the kinds of subject matter that I deal with, I usually rely on the author to have done their research and to know that the thing that they're submitting is going to be looked at for accuracy by the peer review or the professor or whoever it is. So I don't really check facts specifically unless something stands out as not ringing true. So, like for example, I recently edited an article that was written for submission to an international law journal. That's not my field. The topic of the article was the just war policy in 13th to 15th century Florence. Again, not my area. So I didn't feel like I could really question the facts without looking at every source, and there were 6 pages of references and 200 or so footnotes. So I just assumed that person who had already published articles before probably had his facts straight. I didn't worry about that too much. But one thing I do look for is if there's charts or graphs in the piece, and this again is an academic particular thing. I just look to see whether the information presented in the graph or chart actually supports or relates to or agrees with what the textual description of that chart is. And it's possible for an author to accidentally put in the wrong graph, and I've had this happen. I was editing a dissertation for a doctor of theology student who was a young pastor at a megachurch in Atlanta. And his study was looking at evaluating the receptivity to theological, again, not my field, theological messages of the members of his church based on cultural context like age, race, gender, and so on. He had done a lot of statistical analysis, and I told him, I'm not really a statistician, and I'm not going to be able to evaluate the correctness of these particular graphs and charts. I'm a word person, and I think you can relate. But I did look at them to see if the terminology at least related to what he was saying. And I did find one chart that didn't seem to relate to the argument. It had to do with congregants' varying views of the pastor, but it was in the section where he was evaluating the sermon style. So he had evaluated sermon style and pastoral ethos, and he just got the graphs reversed. And this can happen very easily, and when you have a lot of graphs and charts in your piece of writing, it can happen even more easily. So from my time in teaching college writing, there's another aspect of verifying facts that I feel is important to be aware of, And that is the difference between fact and opinion, and how opinion can masquerade as fact. Now, this difference may seem very evident to us, and it certainly should be given what we do for a living, and to most people probably over 20 years old or so. But it's something I try to remain aware of when I'm working on an academic piece or any other kind of a writing that's making an argument. And I would argue that most writing has some kind of an argument in it, whether it's academic or not. We live in a culture in which most of us have been taught all opinions are equally valid, or each opinion is as valid as the others. And there is some truth to that when you're talking about opinions, right? But not all opinions are true or right or supported by facts. And some of my college freshmen had a hard time learning that opinions are not the same as facts, and you can't just say what you think it is and that's the end of your paper. From having studied theory in grad school myself, which includes some of what used to be philosophy, I've come to understand almost all writing as a form of knowledge production. This is what they call it in academia. In theses and dissertations and academic articles and books, scholars are attempting to say something new about a topic, something that no one else has said, or not in that way. In fact, it's actually probably a requirement for a PhD or other doctoral level work that you have something new to say, that you have a conclusion that no one else has come to before, and your work is original. You have to have that, or you will not get it approved. So they marshal the facts, what's been proven by others, the new research that they've conducted, if any, and perhaps using points that are common or accepted knowledge to link it all together and present them in a way that leads to a conclusion, which is new. The irony is that new knowledge starts out as opinion, or at least unverified theory. And it's only when a complete argument is brought to bear that what started out as opinion emerges as fact, or as some new piece of knowledge that can then be used to support another argument that someone might want to make using it. The key thing about making a proper argument is that you need to have not just the facts, but the order and structure of the argument needs to lead to the conclusion without any gaps. And that's what this cartoon you see is referring to. I hope it's still showing it. I saw this years and years ago, and I was hoping I could find it. It took me about 3 hours of searching on the internet and looking through cartoon after cartoon after cartoon, but I finally found it. Some of my freshmen wanted to simply state that their opinion and rely on their belief that all opinions are equally valid without going through the process of analyzing the text that they had read and making a reasonable interpretation using some supporting evidence, including what the text itself actually said. So there was a hole, or sometimes more than one hole, in their argument. They're so cute, they're so sweet, these 18-year-olds, but they're also a little hard-headed sometimes. So this cartoon shows, in a different context, an argument with a hole in it, where the steps of the formula don't actually lead to the conclusion. There's a gap. This is what happens when a written argument isn't fully supported by the evidence. And it's how arguments in academic writing are sometimes not complete, not fully supported. This is one of the things that I look for in the work that I edit. It may be due to not having enough facts, or not using them in ways that support the argument, or interpreting them in ways that aren't reasonable, or they aren't connected to the steps of the argument. There can be many ways that an argument doesn't work, but this is an important thing that I do look for. But I think it's not only academic writing where this kind of miracle happens moment can be found. In most writing that uses facts, nonfiction writing, essays, blog posts, books, and so on, authors are making some kind of argument, and it needs to be a cogent one. These kinds of writers are producing knowledge just as much as I do that may have started out as an opinion, but because it has been articulated in a way that the reader can follow, becomes a new, understandable perspective on something that matters. And as editors, it's our job to make sure that happens.
Can we interrupt? I didn't catch your name.
My name's Betsy Barnum.
Thank you.
We're done?
Yep.
So are we gonna,
Yeah, I have a question for Betsy.
Sure.
What do you build into a contract when you're working with academics?
Well, mostly I try to clarify what the deliverables are, what I'm going to do, what they ask me to do, because it could be anything from substantive editing to creating bibliography or checking for style. All of those things are different. To make sure that we both understand what they want me to do, and kind of how long it's going to take. Although, as you all know, it's impossible to know for sure how much time you're going to need on something. That's pretty much what I try to cover.
Do you build anything in about plagiarism or the right to use something from another source, that type of thing?
You know, I don't. That's not a bad idea, though. I haven't run into plagiarism with academic writers. I did with my students, but not with people who have a little more professionalism. But that's, I probably will try to think about that. Thank you.
Okay, ready for... I'll be the next person, Steve LeBeau, and this is my first attendance at a Penn meeting. How many of you have like a journalistic background? Okay, a little bit, and others are what, writers in different ways?
Sort of.
Technical editing.
Technical editing? Okay.
Medical editing.
Fiction.
Fiction? Okay. Sometimes that can cross over. There you go. Got a slideshow here that'll load up. There it is. So I'm actually have, I don't know if we need this. I actually have two companies. Synapse is something new that I co-founded with my wife. So sitting there, and it's her birthday today, so spending with her, Facebook party. So we do Synapse, which is the Star Tribune is called as an idea firm. And so we have different events and also a weekly podcast. And the basic goal is trying to tear down the silos that separate all the people in the Twin Cities and get people to meet each other. So that's one thing I do. And then what I've been doing for some years, I call it Autobiography Inc. And that's why I'm a ghostwriter basically for that. So done more than a dozen books, and I'm working on a couple right now. So I'm sitting with two PhDs. So I thought I better at least I have a master's degree. So I got the media ethics over at the U. Thesis, moral context of the First Amendment. So if you want to buy me a couple drinks, we can talk about that one. And then I bet I have more business cards than those guys because I worked at all these places. This is my resume. I started at KFAI. I was in graduate school in philosophy, and I thought, boy, if anyone here gets a good idea, no one's ever going to hear about it because they don't know how to talk to regular people. They don't know how to communicate. So when I came back to the Twin Cities, I got involved in KFAI, which you can volunteer and do community radio. And so my career began in radio, which is great in terms of editing because you don't have to worry about spelling people's names properly or punctuation, all that stuff. And I'm still not good at all that. I've still never become a proofreader type. But I did edit audio tape. In the old days, we used a razor blade and put the tape over there. Oh, you made a mistake. You got to dig in the trash in your tape and do it over again. So, Magazine, American Indian Radio did that. KSCP, you've heard of that. KFAN, SPNN is like we have someone here from Minneapolis. Oh, okay. So this is your across the river. So I worked there for a few years and edited videotape. And then I got hired by this guy, and it's like, want to edit him, just kind of, don't say that. But after working for Jesse, that's like 20 years ago now. Then that's when I first got into print as managing editor of the Minneapolis St. Paul Business Journal. And so then I really had to beef up on all my, I'm doing editing all of a sudden. They hire based on talent, not skill. They figured out you can do this job. And so it was like, going into graduate school really quickly and learning. And then I was hired also to teach a class in writing. I don't know. So that's where I learned my grammar, is trying to teach it. And then, what did I do then? At the Business Journal, I also did Fox morning TV for news for about a year. Did some WCCO radio overnight. And then to the Star Tribune, where I was editing a magazine called Mark, which has been discontinued. They killed it when the recession hit in 2008. It's like, oh crap. You know, we had an issue all ready to go, it was all ready to go, the proofreader, and they killed it. Now, in these places, at the Business Journal, basically the reporters did the fact checking. So I was basically looking to see if the story was coherent. Do you have the right facts that support your story? Kind of like you were saying, for supporting an argument. And at the Star Tribune, it was basically a kind of a features stories, but we still had to get the facts right. But once again, that wasn't really on my shoulders. So, but I made sure everyone else did the fact checking. And then Star Tribune, they like I say, during the recession, I was kicked out into the streets. And so then I started being a ghostwriter. That's when Autobiography Inc. started. Started writing books, and so I'll be talking about some of that stuff. And then at Minnesota Business, I got hired there just a few years back. I've been out, and they closed that down too. Don't hire me unless you want to close that. So there, our interns did all the fact checking. And once again, I basically did story checking. So I would call somebody up maybe to check a fact or to clarify something, and I'd find out the whole story was wrong. I mean, they cover it like a new institution comes to town, and they do a story on it. It's like, this isn't what they're doing. This is like, she got amazed with the person who was running it. Oh, it's all about her. No, they don't care about her. Not that she's not interested in her own sake. And for Jesse, kind of the fact checking there was, I was in the communication staff. So I did some of his speeches, I did all the speeches for the Lieutenant Governor, but one of us in the communication staff always had to be with him in kind of a fact check way, because we'd get back and our boss would say, did Jesse say this? And we'd say, yeah, he did. He said that. So that was what we did there. And then one of the first books I did was Ella Pillsbury Crosby. So you've heard of the Pillsburys, and the Crosbys, she's from the Washburn Crosbys. So her grandfather started Pillsbury Company. Her husband's grandfather started General Mills. When they were engaged, it was featured in Time magazine as in the transitions column, Pillsbury marries General Mills. So, and when you do these historical books, basically you interview them and do other research, and they tell their story, and you have to, get into the book in her voice. I was the voice of a 95-year-old woman. And they said, it sounds like her, so I guess I'm an actor too. So, this was their summer home. Southbridge. It was recently torn down, but they're trying to sell it for $54 million, that didn't work, $25 million, that didn't work. Finally, they just tore it down and used a bunch of lots. It's right in the middle of Lake Minnetonka. And this is actually a page from the book. And so one thing to ask people doing a memoir, what's your first memory? Well, my first memory was sitting in front of this house owned by this guy named Northrop. And let's see if we have that next. And so it's like Northrop. Is it Northrop with an O or Northrop with a U? This isn't radio. I have to actually write it down, and I have to choose one of those letters. And she said, well, could it be Cyrus Northrop? Because the Pillsburys were big in the founding of the University of Minnesota. So Northrop Auditorium, Cyrus Northrop, that's with an O. Was it his house? No, it wasn't his. Well, who was it? Well, some guy involved with wool. Some sort of wool business. Okay, there's a lot to go on. So, but they also, when I did it, the family was very beneficial. They gave me a book to look at, Legendary Homes in Lake Minnetonka, by Betty Jones Hamill. And so I read that, and this is the house. So she remembers being at that house when she was, because Southways was built when she was 5. So a lot of the wealthy people in town would go out to the lake because the breeze was the only air conditioning. So that was their summer house. And so this is just a quote from the book, from this section of the book. In 1894, Preston King, a treasurer of Northrop King and Company, sold a portion of his Lakeshore Ferndale property to William G. Northrop, perhaps a relative of Jesse Northrop, the firm's first president. Northrop named his house Bonside, Scottish for something. And So it's like, well, I know the guy was involved in the bull business. How come the author of this book didn't know who the heck he was? So I started Googling, and that's my answer to how to do fact checking. Google the hell out of things. And there are different sites that help for this or that, but and you try a variety of things. And so I tried Googling, his name and the address of the place on Ferndale. And what worked was when I dialed, when I used bonsai. That kind of clicked in. And so I found out, holy cow, they're spelling the guy's name wrong. It's not Northrop, it's Northup. Because there is, this is from the Social Register 1912, and the Summer Register. This is where you can find them in the summer. In the winter you get his town home somewhere in Minneapolis. So there it is, bonsai, and you can say, okay, so that's why they screwed up. That's why this woman didn't know that the guy was in fact the president of, here's this real picture, William Guile Northup. And he was head of North Star Mills, North Star Woolen Mills, which made blankets. And it was right there alongside all the grain mills, all those other mills on St. Anthony Falls. And it became the biggest producer of blankets in the country for quite a while he was running it. Then his kid took over. By 1949 it was gone. But, and so then they, one thing you can find on all these searchings is the gravestones. There it is, William Guile Northup, 1851 to 1929. But if you look around and spell it Northrop, that'll pop up more often. Somehow the misspelling got in there. In fact, the 1919 Social Register had it misspelled as Northrop. And it's everywhere. And so there's a museum in Massachusetts, a textile museum, and they have something on their website, and they have them Northrop. The whole story about the woolen mills, and then at the bottom, sometimes spelled Northup. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it's spelled correctly. So that's the story there. So here, so the big thing in fact checking is, what is your source? Who's saying this? So I listened to a 95-year-old woman rather than a book. It's not the obvious thing, but you never know what the actual source is. Now, here's another book. This was like people of the same ilk. I'm not identifying them. But, well, actually, that's F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'll identify him. This is just a picture I grabbed because the family I did this book for, her mother was a flapper, born 1900. And so in the 1920s, she was in her 20s. What a great time to be in your 20s in the 1920s. And they were friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald. So this is my client's mother, and here's the story. They were at a country club. They were, part of the story, they were friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald. And the story that they always told, they were at a country club before the parents were married. And all of a sudden they get a call. The father's sister was having a baby. He had to leave right away, go drive her to the hospital. And so he said, hey, F. Scott, can you drive my flapper wife home? Sure. Well, then what happened, F. Scott got so drunk he was lying on the floor under the table somewhere. And so she had to find another ride home. They tell that story, and it's got to go in the book. So how do you fact check that story? Well, the one fact I knew for sure, well, I Googled around and found out, yes, Scott Fitzgerald had been to that club. Okay, it was in Minneapolis, he'd been there. So I knew that part, okay, that's nothing fishy there. But then I knew the one fact I had anchored down was the date where the sister had her baby. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, he's such a person, he's so famous, you can find where he was every minute of his life. He did this, he was there, he was here, he was here. And so I found out he was nowhere near Minnesota at that date. And so I had to go to the family and say, well, this story is not true. At least the way it's told, it's not true. But, oh, what do you mean? You know the adage, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. So, and what you can do, especially in journalism, is Is the sky falling? Well, I'm not going to say the sky falling, but President Trump says the sky is falling. That you can use, as long as you attribute it to somebody. So we decided it was such a good story that we just, the way it came in the book was, my mother always told this story. So there it's grounded. But, and so I don't know exactly what happened. You know, maybe it happened like that at a different time. Who knows? Maybe they just joined those two things together. But they had another story. They were out, the flapper and her husband were off in Europe with their friends. They met up with the Fitzgeralds at some hotel in Paris and had a gay old time in the 1920s. And so I looked that up, and indeed, they were in Europe at that time. F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda were at that hotel at that time. So that was probably true. So that went in without saying, Mom said. So. And then, just some food for thought. You touched on some of these things, Betsy, but what is a fact? I mean, in my studies of everything, I started out in philosophy, and so I kind of question everything, and especially as a journalist, you question everything again. A fact is a concept that people made up. I'm sure a fact has a different meaning depending on whether you're in academia or in science or in politics or whatever. We have alternative facts these days. So it comes from an ancient word meaning to make or to do. So it actually came from a verb, and they nouned it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that the right word?
I like that.
They nouned it. And so related words are factory, facile, difficile, but also fiction. Fiction is something you made. So a fact could, is related to the word fiction. So it is a useful thing to say, what is a fact? And relevant facts depend upon your purpose. I mean, look at how many facts are in this room. There's the number of tables, the number of chairs, the number of coats, the number of people. There are all these facts, where the clock is. Which facts do you pick out? Well, it depends on your purpose. If you're going to come in here and paint this room, the facts that matter are just the square, or square feet of wall space that needs paint. If you're here to see what the capacity is, well, then you look for the volume of the room. So you look for different facts depending on what your purpose is. And so that varies quite a bit. And what's the relationship between the truth and a fact? Global warming means that coastal areas will be flooded. Now, is that a fact? It could be true, but is it a fact? It hasn't happened yet. So there's where it comes. People that define these things might have different answers. Even the fact checkers, I read an article, the fact checkers that come after all the political speeches, there's different organizations now, they don't always agree. And facts, sources, and attribution, part of what journalism does is they try to cover their butt. Oh, he shot her. Oh, he allegedly shot her. That's down there, but you always want to step away. There was a case recently where there was just kind of an outlandish racist statement made by somebody. And one news organization, I forget which one, said an alleged racist comment. And they held that for a couple of days, and finally all the other media ashamed of, what do you mean allegedly racist? That's as racist as you can get. And finally, okay, they're just trying to cover their butts. So allegedly. And the facts versus the story, I mentioned that kind of at the beginning. I've had to go to do some fact check and find out the story is all wrong. The story is all wrong. So usually what I worry about is the story, especially as I've been an editor-in-chief and managing editor. You worry about the coherence of the story, or the coherence of the argument. And then the facts, those are like your little anchors that tie that story to earth, to reality. And so to see how those things fit together. And then can reporting facts be unethical? And this is well, you know that if you're in a war and the troops are here, that's a fact. But if you report it, it's unethical. It might even be illegal. I don't know if it's against the Constitution, but you don't want to let the enemy know where your troops are, because that's bad. Now, there's a case that happened not too long ago. Of course, everything for me seems not too long. It's about 30 years ago, maybe.
Oh,
It wasn't that long ago, but when they had the Grand Forks flooding, and then the fire, it's like it was just chaos in that town. And all of a sudden, this angel appeared, a very wealthy angel. And this money would get donated here, get donated there, and boy, it changed the whole feeling of that town. And her plane was sitting there. So the reporters could see the plane and run the license plate. And one reporter decided, no, I don't want to ruin the spirit of this town. And the other one said, it's my job as a reporter to report all the facts. It was the wife of the McDonald's owner. Huh?
Ray Kroc.
Yeah, Ray Kroc's wife. You know, she had a lot of money giving it away and doing good things. And so it's like, as soon as that was out, sure it's true, sure it's a fact, but everybody, you know, it's like there's no Santa Claus. It's just Ray Kroc's wife. And somehow took the magic out of it. So was that ethical to report that fact? The reporters, one of them did, one of them didn't. But it was kind of a, you know, one of the big tenets in journalism is do no harm. I don't know. That seems kind of harmful. What good did it do? Well, I did my job. I reported a fact. I scooped it. Great for you. Anyway. So these are some food for thought, and I think that's the end. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about what Synapse is?
Well, it's an LLC, and we
Or is there a website?
yeah, you can go to our website and find out more. Yeah, it's a social enterprise. If I can take a minute, should I take a minute? I think one of the biggest problems, and it's obvious looking at politics, how disconnected everybody is from each other. But if you look at the Twin Cities region, there's all kinds of disconnections based on race, culture, economics, geography. I know people in Wayzata that won't go on Lake Street because it's too dangerous. You know, there's disconnections based on occupation. You know, all the commercial real estate people know each other, but who else do they know? So the job of Synapse is try to connect these things, and so we've been having events, and we're aiming for half people of color at every event. And it worked pretty much for all of them except for one we had in Eden Prairie, which even I had trouble pointing out. So there's something that we call the friendship gap. And they did some research on the racial composition of social networks. And what they found is it's very disconnected, all the races. And the most disconnected, of course, are white people. The average white person knows one black person, one Asian, it's like they got a rainbow checklist, you know, they know one of everything. The average black person knows 8 white people, but no Asians. Nationwide, 75% of whites only know other whites. And it's worse in the Midwest. 82% of whites in the Midwest only know other whites. They only socialize with other whites. So how do you think they put the freeway through Rondo? How many blacks were on the panel that made that decision? You know, like less than none. So anyway, our idea is that if we connect people, it'll just be better. It's like the old Silk Road. Whenever there was an intersection, people would trade products, but they'd also exchange ideas, and that's where civilization grew. Diverse ideas coming together is the source of all innovation. So it's a big, big deal in business now for people that pay attention to those studies, diversity studies. The more people you know, the more diverse people you know, the bigger picture of truth you have. So anyway, that's what Synapse tries to do, those things. Anyway.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad we decided on the order that we did, because my presentation is going to be nice in between the two of yours.
Good.
I started out as a laboratory scientist. My PhD is in medical genetics, and I spent about 10 years before joining McGraw-Hill's Healthcare Information Group as an associate editor. And I worked for 4 of their publications and their special publications group. And I learned a lot more about writing and editing as a PhD and published author. I thought I knew a lot about writing, but I really learned a hell of a lot more as an editor and then later as a writer, working as an editor, and it shaped what I do now. And I currently work as a freelance writer and editor. I started out in freelancing partly because of the sort of semi-collapse of the publication industry from 2005 to 2009. So at McGraw-Hill, which I'll draw most of my talk from, we edited peer-reviewed articles and prepared them for production. And unlike a lot of organizations where the job duties are quite segmented, you're a writer, you're a copy editor, you're a proofreader, ours was more inclusive, and we spent more time with manuscripts. We used an editorial checklist that included things like the journal style and other things, but we also had to do fact-checking as needed because our editing process was probably different from the typical editing process where the journals get the magazine article already peer-reviewed and it's just a matter of putting it in the style, doing some fact-checking and publishing. That's a gross oversimplification, but probably a good encapsulation of the process. So we had a lot more leeway with it, and we had to check facts, and because the publications dealt with, they were addressed toward physicians, and they were addressed primarily to primary care physicians. So anything a primary care physician would cover, we covered in our articles. The sole exception probably being oncology. We didn't do anything with cancer, although I write about cancer now. So we had a lot more leeway, and so when we had to check facts, it was your job to make sure everything was up to snuff before it went to the production staff, because changing things once they're in proofs is a costly process. And when magazines went from paper proofs to computerized processes, if you made a mistake in the proofs and had to correct it, it was $500 to burn another CD to send to the production staff. And so naturally, I wanted to make sure things were up to, everything was correct before it went to press, which was a good experience because it taught me a lot of things. I still have to fact check my own work as a writer because frequently statistics change from year to year, information changes, guidelines change. So in the time I have available, I wanted to do 3 things. Was one, to review the fact-checking process, and second, and probably important for people who are not biomedical writers, was to present a selected list of resources and the caveats for using them. And I've got a handout that if you don't have, I have extra copies of for different sources. And then as sort of a segue or wrap up, to provide some examples of successes and failures in fact-checking in both medical articles, which I primarily deal with, but because I know from attending another PEN meeting that there are fiction writers here, I included a couple of examples from fiction that stuck with me, even though the books are a few years old now, but they sort of highlight that it's important in fiction too to make things hold together. So in our production process, we checked, we made sure that the items were in the manuscript were correct before they went to the production staff. And the common items we looked at were author, affiliation, medical device company, company name and location, drug names, disease names, and disease statistics, among other things. Now, some of that overlaps with editing, so like I said, the position I was in was sort of a hybrid, everything in one, and as the economics tightened, so did the job responsibilities. I was sort of a nice go-to person for the organization because in addition to having a reasonable writing, editing background, which I thought was reasonable when I got there, and I found out it wasn't quite as good as I thought it was. I also had a science background and a biomedical background, and so when articles came through that were highly technical or that nobody wanted to deal with, I was sort of the go-to guy for doing the editing, getting it in shape. So most of my work is biomedical writing, and so the fact-checking resources that I use are ones that are primarily biomedical, but I also include a few, and they're also listed on the handout. For most people these days, it's the almost omnipotent web. You can go and find almost anything, but as both of our other speakers have indicated, a lot of times there's wrong information on the web, so you have to be careful about where you look. So I just thought I would cover 5 or so of the places that I go to for when I have to confirm a fact or an article. PubMed is a website that is useful for checking authors, titles, articles, journal content, and conclusions. Unfortunately, not all the articles are in the database, so some are behind a paywall, some you may have to go somewhere else for. And one of the pitfalls I commonly came in contact with is something behind a paywall, and so you wound up looking at the abstract. You need to be aware that abstracts that get published have a fairly high error rate. There have been a number of studies that have documented that. So it's always a good idea to check the original article to confirm facts before you put them in your article, when you check them. And actually I had a writing project that was due last week, in which I found the abstract to the article that I was going to use as a small news item. But when I got to the actual, it was a poster presentation, there were another dozen authors that weren't included in the abstract, and there were also other things. This was from a clinical study, but just goes to show you have to make sure what you're looking at is correct. The other 3 other big websites that I use, one is clinicaltrials.gov. It's the FDA registry for all clinical trials, and it has all the information that you might need, including the formal title for a given trial. Sometimes they have cutesy acronyms. The caveat with using clinical trials is it's periodically updated, so the information might not be up to date, so you might have to stretch a bit and contact the principal investigator or the study manager to get what's current. But it's a good place to go to, and it's accurate. For diseases and disease statistics, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have a lot of information that's useful and it's easy to access, and for people that deal with copyright, it's available without copyright fee, which is important. And it's especially nice because, at least in my journal experience, sometimes you get an article that will cite statistics that would be last year's or the year before, because there's often a lag time between the time an article